Hey guys, it's Casey and welcome back for another Unreal tutorial. So today I want to talk about a pretty cool tool that I don't think many people know about. It's definitely something I did not know about for the longest time, and it nearly saved my life on one of my games. Like, it was so handy when I finally realized that this existed, and that is navigation modifiers, and more specifically navigation query filters. So before we really dive into it, I want to show why it's important. So on our left here we have an AI, and all he's going to do is chase me on the player as the right, and we're going to show off kind of what's happening here. And when we hit play, you can see how he's chasing the player. And while he's alone, we don't really notice anything wrong. The things we can notice is that he's always trying to find the shortest path. That's how A# works, in that he's gonna just find the shortest path. And what is the shortest path? Well, he's gonna hug the walls, and you can see right when he turns a corner, he's on a dime. It's perfect. Why? Because that's just the shortest path. Hitting that apex is just naturally the cheapest thing to do. While that's not a problem by himself, watch what happens when we just add some more AI here. Let's just add 6 of them. And now let's hit play and do the same exact thing. Watch how our AI is kind of okay spread out, but watch what happens very quickly while we're playing this game. Do you see what's happening with our AI? They're immediately starting to clump, and then right when we take any kind of corner, how do they end up, right? And even if we try and get away from the walls now and kind of go out in the open, what happens with our AI? They end up just in this perfectly straight line, and now we can try and turn to try and separate them, but it's just a natural thing for the AI, since they're all trying to calculate what is the shortest path. Very naturally, through gameplay, they're all going to end up on that same path. They're all going to converge to it, and you can see how that's not really desirable as far as AI goes. If we want a bunch of AI chasing our player, that doesn't really look good. So one of the cool tools that I found was navigation query filters. So before we get to navigation query filters, we can just talk about normal Navmesh area modifiers. So if we right click and we make a new blueprint class, if we type in nav, we can make a navigation area. Now, I've already made one. I've done some pre-setup because sometimes when you make these, you have to restart the editor for them to take effect. So it's a little odd, so I've gone ahead and already done the legwork. But if we make a new nav area, here I've made one and I've called it high cost area. And if we open it up, you can see we get 3 options here. The first one is the default cost. The second is the fixed entering cost. And if we go back to the default values, they start as 1 and 0, and then the color. So if we want to talk about the cost, and a good way to illustrate the cost is if we actually drag in this Navmesh modifier. So on the top left here, if we just go under our areas up here, our basic if we wanted to, and type in nav, we get a Nav Modifier Volume. If we drag in our Nav Modifier Volume and press P, you can see how our normal nav mesh is green. But by default, when we drag in a nav modifier, it kills it. And the reason why it kills it is because our area class over here is set to null. If we go into the high cost area that we've created here, you can see how it changes color. That red is the color that we denoted right here, right? So what we can basically think of this default cost as is while it's trying to calculate a path through this area, that cost is going to either be higher, so we could make it twice the cost of the green area. And what that means is that if we tried to navigate through this area, when it's calculating its path, it would say, whoa, this red area is 2 times the cost as this green area. Maybe it's cheaper to just go through the green area instead of cutting through the red, right? Or if we wanted to, we could make it like half the cost. So when it gets anywhere near that red area, it's like, man, that red line right there, if we wanted to even make it bigger, that red line is much cheaper than that green line. Let's run through the red line, right? And then the other option we have here is the entering cost. And that, like the default cost, is part of calculating the path, but that's only when first entering the red. We could make it really expensive and say, hey, to enter this red area, you must really, really want to. And we could make it some like absurd number, or we could make it a smaller number and just say, hey, to like slightly manipulate you, we're just going to make it slightly more expensive to skip into this red area than the green. And that's just basically what that means. So if we just want to drag this over to our corner now, let's actually make it more expensive, and we'll actually see what happens here. We'll make it a bit more expensive just to like really show this off. So this high cost area, let's just make it like 100 and 100. We're just gonna make this like absurdly expensive to kind of show this off. So now when I hit play and they chase me over to this corner, watch what happens. Before they were hugging the wall and hitting the apex, now what do? You can see they're just skipping all the way around that red. But the issue still remains, they end up in a straight line. All we did was move the apex from the corner off into the distance, so we didn't really change much there. So if we think about it, that means that while we could use this Navmesh area, modifier to modify their navigation, the issue we have is that it modifies all of their navigation, right? What if we can just make it so that that messed with one of our AI or two of our AI, right? What if we could make it modify only some of our AI and not others? And that's where query filters come in. So I'm going to delete this area. And now when I right click and I go into our blueprint class, if we take nav again, instead of doing a nav area, we have our navigation query filters here. And I've already made a few of them. So if we make one of them, what happens is that when you open it up, oops, that's not right. We want the query filter. Sorry, that's the areas. We want our query filter. Sorry, these 4 areas are the same thing as this high cost area. If we open them up, they all just have colors associated with them with the default values. And that's our 4 areas here. But we have 4 query filters here that I've also made. So when we make a query filter and we open one up, I don't know why it's compiling. If we look inside of it right here, what we would by default see is just these 3 tabs. Normally your areas tab is empty, but what I've done is I've added 4 elements to it. And you can see if we just go into one element and we close the others, we can select our navigation areas that we've made, our modifier volumes. And here I've made 4 AI areas that I just showed you, all with default values. All I did was make 4 modifier volumes, 4 nav areas, and just set their names and change their colors. That's it. All their values are the same. However, you can see here when we, inside this query filter, say AI area 1, we get these overrides, which is really cool. So as we had this high cost area before that affected all of our AI, now we can override its cost so that every AI potentially sees it with a different value. And that's what I set up here. So in navigation filter 1, I set up the 4 areas. I set up area 1 to area 4 in query 1, but I made, oops, I screwed that up. Sorry for that F word, it's like F-bomb there. For area 1, I made it cheaper to navigate through, and for the others, I made them more expensive, and that's the same for all of them. So in query filter 1, AI area 1 is cheaper, and 2, 3, and 4 are more expensive. And if we save that, and we go into, say, query filter 2, I made area 2 cheaper, and I made areas 1, 3, and 4 more expensive, and that's the same for all of them, right? So for area 3 is cheaper, query 3, area 3 is cheaper, and 1, 2, and 4 are more expensive. And last for 4, and query filter 4, area 4 is cheaper, and 1, 2, and 3 are more expensive, right? So I basically just associated the filter number with the area number and made that more expensive and made the others more, or made that one more cheap and the others more expensive. So with that confusing rambling over, what I've done is I've pre-laid some navigation areas beforehand, and now let's drag them back up. So you can see the different colors here, and these colors are associated with our AI areas. And by default, remember, they all have a default cost of just 1. There's no change in these areas. But with those 4 query filters, these 4 areas will all have different costs depending on which filter is activated. So how do we activate those filters? Well, if we open up my AI character here, it's just the default character pawn. This is the only code inside of it. On begin play, we're using this move to actor node. Normally, you might be tempted to use, if we type move to use the simple move to actor node, but you can see here we get no options. We can just say this is our controller, that's our goal. For simple purposes, like it says, useful, good, just do it. But if we use this move to actor node, or there's also one called move to location, which we have to use our reference from our controller and then type move to location, you can see how we get the same type of thing with the same extra options, but we can say we can navigate to a vector instead of an actor reference. But the really useful thing here is this purple thing right here, and if we use the drop down box, you can see all of the query filters that we've made. And what I essentially just did right here is I said, hey, we have 4 query filters, so all I did was I did a select here. I just added the 4 options to it, and then all I said is on begin play, when our AI goes to move towards our character, just randomly select an integer 0 to 3 to randomly select one of our 4 filters, right? And then we just move towards the character. So the code is the exact same as before, but all we're doing is hooking up this little bit saying, hey, use this query filter. And if we wanted to, we could do the same thing and promote this to a variable and say this is our navigation query, and on begin play, we could set our navigation query the same exact way and then just use the variable. It's the same exact code, but instead we're setting it to reuse that variable later, or if for simplicity purposes, we could just hook that straight up into our move to actor. So with those query filters made, all of our AI are going to randomly select from one of those 4 queries, and each of those queries prefers one of these colors over the other. So with all that rambling done, let's see what happens now when we start running around. It might not be perfect because we might need to manipulate the numbers a little bit, but you can see there's a little bit of AI hiccups with it, but watch how they're not all running in a straight line, right? You can see how they're all kind of preferring their own areas. Maybe we need to manipulate these numbers a bit more and maybe make them a bit different from each other, but you can see perfectly right there how they're all spreading out and they're all running in their own lanes. Now, for using this in the final game, you definitely need to hammer down the values, figure out how to make it look more natural and stuff like that, and you can actually see when we run through this little alley right here, they weren't separating enough, and that's probably because our costs, or we might need to use some entering costs and manipulate that a bit differently. But you can see how now when we start running our AI, they're not clumping as hard. Where they're starting to spread out. And this was really useful in a game I made. If we just restart it, just this initial bit I think is the most telling. And that you can see how you can clearly see they're all selecting their own lanes before running to the player. And I think that's the most telling one. Now, obviously, to make it look more natural, you need to manipulate it, find which numbers make sense. But in the grand scheme of things, this is very important if we're having a bunch of AI moving around or moving in groups, whether you're hard coding their locations to be different, or in this case, where we're just saying move towards the player, we need a way of separating them. Now, I use that system, this query filter system, along with some other systems that were a bit more complex to kind of achieve my goal. But another thing that I did is I essentially made dummy locations next to my player also, and that, like, say I duplicate the player, this center player was the only real player, but I kind of had these dummy locations out to the side of the player also, and the AI, not only would they select randomly from the navigation filter, when they wanted to chase the player, they would also randomly select either the player or one of the dummy players that didn't really exist. It was just a location next to the player, and then those two systems combined really made it so that when my AI was chasing the player, they weren't just running in straight lines. Whether it's after they turned corners or whether it was out in the open, the AI would spread a bit. So I think those two tools together, I think, were really useful. But I think these query filters are something not that many people know about. I knew about the modifiers for the longest time, but the issue I was having with my game is that, well, if I throw in a modifier, it affects all the AI, so I'm not achieving anything, I'm not separating them. But by actually associating these query filters with different values to the modifiers, that's how you achieve your goal of achieving not randomness, but achieving differentiation between your AI and their movement. So that's it for me. I hope that was useful. I hope I explained that and didn't ramble too hard on some of those things. But that's navigation query filters. They're really useful. Check them out, and I'll see you guys in the next tutorial.